Hi, I'm Amy Seipke. I'm the librarian that works with the College of Engineering and Computer Science here at U of M-Dearborn. And today we're going to talk about AI, what it's good for, what some of the issues are around it, and how you might be able to use it for your work. So the part of the library where I work is called the Library Research Center. There are 8 of us. Each of us specialize in different departments. Like I said, I work with CECS. I also work with mathematics. And then my colleagues all work with different departments as well. So if you find yourself doing some sort of cross-departmental research, needing some specific information from another field, you might want to reach out to one of my colleagues. Or if you come into the library and you stop into the LRC, you'll find one of us at the work table here in the LRC during 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. And we can answer, whoever's there can answer your questions about general resources, how to get access to things here in the library, if you need help with anything like that. Okay, so on to today's topic, artificial intelligence, AI, right? That's not really what we're talking about. That doesn't really exist yet, right? Like you may be working on that for some of your other classes, but as far as tools that are currently usable that you can use right now, that's not really what this is. It's not an intelligence. Nothing is doing any thinking. What we're talking about right now, when people refer to AI, they're talking about big data machines that have been trained on a data set. They can recognize patterns, they can make predictions, they can rework the information that they've been trained on to make it appear like it's coming from an intelligent source. So let's talk about what we're really talking about. For this presentation, we're talking about GPTs, really, which is generative pre-trained transformers. And that's a lot better phrase to describe what it really does, right? It's been trained on a set of data. It can transform the data that it's been trained on into a different product and generate something new, right? So it's a generative pre-trained transformer, a GPT. Okay, so what we're talking about is a GPT, not really AI. So the big one that we all know about is ChatGPT, which is run by OpenAI. So it's free to use for everyone. So if it's free and it's got the word open right there in the title, what could possibly be the problem with using it? I'm sure we're all familiar with the idea, if not the phrase, that if you're not paying for it, you're not the customer. You're actually the product. So what is the motivation for having it be free and open, right? They could be doing a lot of, there could be a lot of motivations. They could be training the next generation on the information that you're giving it. So if you're including an article and asking it to summarize it, now it knows that article when it didn't have that before, didn't have access to that before. So it could be training itself and getting better and better based on what you're giving it. It could be taking the information that you're helping it to create and putting that into its knowledge bank. So if you're giving it a piece of code and asking it to validate it, once it validates it, now it can put it in its code bank and now it has your code. It could just be that once people get really reliant on it, they're going to put it behind a paywall and then you'll have to pay to use a service that you're used to using. But we don't really know, right? So the one that we use here at the university is UM-Chat-GPT, and it's a little bit different because you are paying for it. It was created here at U of M, so you're paying for it with your tuition dollars. And so it's only available to people in the U of M community, and we're able to have a reasonable expectation that our interactions aren't being sold or used to train other systems. So the FAQs for that are here at this link. Okay, so now that we know exactly what it is that we're talking about, what could be some of the problems that could arise from using a GPT to do your classwork or to help you do work once you get out into the field? So the number one problem is that you don't have any control over the data. So you don't know where it came from and you don't know where it's going to go. So it could be obtained illegally or unethically. So I pulled a couple of articles to highlight those points. So the first one here talks about it could be obtained illegally because maybe it should not have ever had access to the information that it trained on. So one of the problems that's been found is that it seems to be pulling articles and training itself on articles that were behind paywalls that should not have been accessible to the public. So it's breaking the intellectual property rights of the authors of those original articles that it trained on. So it knows things it shouldn't know. And then point two here is that the work of training the AI is really quite intensive. And there has been a lot of issues with some of the labor practices that have been going into the training of these. And so there's an article about some of those as well. Another problem is that it could be stealing your ideas. So it could be training itself on the questions that you're asking. And it could be, so for example, if you put a piece of code in and you asked it to help find the problem with the code, if you've created a piece of code that does something new and novel, now it knows that. And it can use that and give that answer back to somebody in the future. So if you've created a piece of code that, makes this robot turn in this specific way, now if somebody says, hey, I need a piece of code that makes this robot turn in this way, now it knows your code and can give it to someone else. Also, you can't really control what happens to any of the, well, sort of goes with that one. You can't really control what happens to the information that you help it create. The example I was thinking of for this one is like my husband is a paint formulation chemist. So if he were to look for an offset for one of the components of a paint, and he puts his formulation into here and says, I need, to replace the resin with something by a different company. Now it knows the paint formulation, right? And that is a trade secret for his company. And so then he's given away, well, he wouldn't actually do that. But if he were to do that, he would have given away, a trade secret from his company. And now the company has lost control of their own IP. And there's an article here about a couple of instances where that's happened. So the second major problem with using a GPT to do your classwork or work out in industry is that you're not really going to be producing the highest quality work. It's academically dishonest of you to claim someone else's work as your own, even if that isn't a separate intelligence whose work you're claiming. If you didn't write it, it's not really yours, so that could be considered plagiarism. And as cliche as it is to say, you'd be cheating yourself out of a learning opportunity. As instructors, we don't usually necessarily care what answer you come up with. What we're really looking for is to train you on how to use the process to come up with an answer. So if you're using the GPT to come up with an answer instead of thinking through the process on your own, when you're faced with a similar problem later in the future, you won't have had the practice working through the problem. And so you'll have cheated yourself out of the opportunity to learn that here with guidance. It can give you the wrong information, right? We've all heard about the hallucinations in these GPTs. But that's really the way that it's created, right? And there's nothing telling it that the information it gives you back has to be correct and factual in the world. If it's been trained on poetry or been trained on fiction writing or been trained on political propaganda, then that's what it thinks you're going to want back. So it's predicting what it thinks the next word you want is. It doesn't necessarily mean that the words that go together in the order that they're going to put them have to be true. So, like I said about political, it could be biased, right? There are lots of instances that we've seen these be, overtly biased, but there's a bias in every data set. So no matter what data set it's been trained on, that bias could just be what is excluded, right? I'll show you an example of this one in a little bit. It's going to mimic whatever it was fed. Hopefully it isn't up to date, because hopefully it's not continuously training itself on the information you're giving it, because that would mean it was stealing all your ideas, right? So if it's not stealing all your ideas, then it's not up to date. because at some point its training has stopped and it won't know anything beyond that. It won't be able to give you back anything that's more recent than when its training stopped. And then F, I'll show you this one in a minute too, another example of this, but it does exactly what it's been programmed to do, which isn't necessarily what you as the user want it to do. So what kind of librarian would I be if I didn't give you sources for my information? So that's what you can see here is these are some of the articles that I read while I was preparing for this presentation. And these articles give you some of those examples that I mentioned earlier about different ways that you're not really controlling the data that the chatbots are being trained on, or the data that they're creating or that you're giving to them. And then here is a citation and a quote about how it can give you the wrong information. This box at the top is, a screenshot right off of the website for the UM-GPT, and it tells you right at the top, states right clearly out that you should evaluate the results of the service because it can give you wrong information. And then further down there is another article from the Washington Post with some examples of it giving factually incorrect information as well. So I also did a couple of trials here of our UM GPT to see what sorts of answers it would give me and to see if I could get it to give me some examples of some of these points that I've been trying to make. So here's an example of it being confidently wrong, even though the correct information is in its training set. So for this one, I asked it to write me a short biography of Elon Musk. So it wrote me a short biography of Elon Musk. And one of the facts, with heavy air quotes, that it gave me was that it says Musk then founded X.com. And I said, I'm pretty sure that's not true. So I asked it specifically, I said, did Elon Musk found X.com? And it says, while he played a significant role, he was not the original founder of X.com. So even though it had in its training set that he wasn't the founder, when I initially asked it, it told me that he was. So it was very confident here in its writing. It never said, some people say, or some people think. It was very confident. It says, Musk then founded X.com. But when I asked it specifically, it had in its training set that he didn't. It just gave me the wrong information. The other main example I gave earlier about how these programs don't always give you the best information was that it could be biased, right? So here's a couple examples that I pulled from this article that I cited at the bottom. One example was when sorting through applications. So if it's trained on a set of successful applications, so people that got the job and succeeded really well, they trained it on their applications because they want it to find people that have similar qualifications that they think would similarly be successful at the job, right? So if most of those people who are currently in the position who've been successful have been men, the AI might determine that one of the qualifications you're looking for, without saying it, is that they're men. And so then it would only pull out men to put into the hopeful prospects bucket. And in that way, it could cause bias in hiring. Another one of the examples from this article also had to do with hiring. And it was how if you were programming the system to look for keywords in your applications and cover letters, and that system is programmed by men and women tend to use different types of language. So they sort of speak differently and use different words to mean the same sort of thing. So if the system is programmed by men, they're going to program it with the words that they would use. And so it's going to look for language that would skew more towards hiring more men than hiring women, because it's not looking for the words that women would be using in the same circumstances. And then the third example from this article, it was about healthcare. So what this one found was that it tended to be the case that white people would get more follow-up care because it was more available to them. They had better access to the ability to get follow-up care after a major incident. And it showed that this system noticed that, and then it inferred that they needed more follow-up care because they were getting more follow-up care. And so if they're getting more follow-up care, it says they need more follow-up care. And so then as a result, it offers them more follow-up care and more support in the future. And so that would be another way where this systems bias could hurt people because they're not being offered the follow-up care that they really need because historically they haven't been able to get the follow-up care that they need. And so again, it's perpetuating that same type of bias. So those are 3 examples of why that would be a really dangerous issue with using AI to determine hiring or medical care. This is a less serious but more obvious example of bias in its training. And this is another one where it actually was trained on a full enough set of information. It just predicted the first thing that I was going to want and left out all the other things that it already, air quotes again, knows. So even though it was trained on all this information, it just gave me the first thing it thought I wanted. So I said, please, write me a short essay about 16th century art. And so it did. And in its example, it says Renaissance, Mannerism, Roman artists, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo. And so it just keeps giving me examples of Italian art from the 16th century. So I said, well, I know there was art happening in places other than Italy. What about art that was happening outside of Italy during this time? So now it tells me Spain, the Netherlands, Bruegel, Germany, Hans Holbein. So it's still giving me European art. And I said, okay, tell me more about art in the Americas. And it has information about art in the Americas. It just wasn't what it gave me the first or second time I asked it about art during the 16th century. So it knows things about art in the Americas in the 16th century, but that wasn't what it predicted I wanted to hear. So it's not what it gave me. So if you had just read this first article, you'd say, oh, this is a pretty good little essay about 16th century art, but it's leaving out the rest of European art. It's leaving out American art. It's leaving out Asian art. It's leaving out African art. So it's leaving out all of the other, things that you might also be interested in learning about. So reading that, you'd think the first one, you'd think, oh, well, that must be all the art that was happening in the world at that time. Right. So if you don't know to keep adjusting your prompt until it gets what you're really looking for, you might miss out on some interesting perspectives as well. And then the other thing that I said we were going to talk about was software is programmed to do exactly what it's programmed to do, right? So this article here talks about something that it terms as edge cases, which is when it's doing something that isn't what you thought it was going to do. So this one's talking about an Uber self-driving car that actually ended up killing a woman because it was programmed to avoid cyclists and it was programmed to avoid pedestrians, but the system didn't know what to do about someone who was walking a bike across the street. I actually saw a couple of different takes on this one. One of them said that it was because she was walking a bike across the street and it didn't know how to handle that. And another one said that it was because it was only scanning near crosswalks for pedestrians, and that she was crossing in the middle of the street, and so it didn't know to look for her. Either way, it was doing what it was programmed to do and not what we needed it to do in the real world, right? So that's another thing to be watching for, is to remember always garbage in, garbage out, right? Computers do exactly what you're telling them to do. Okay, so now we've discussed a whole bunch of issues with AI, but that wasn't the name of our presentation. The name of our presentation was, what is it good for? So back to our original question, what is it good for? So here are some uses that would usually be acceptable in an academic setting. generating ideas or brainstorming to try to come up with maybe your topic or to focus in on just narrowing or broadening and getting just the right topic for, the length of your project. Helping relieve writer's block. So sometimes you get so focused on trying to get just the right word and, that one next word that you stop being able to get ideas out. So this might be a good way to work on that. To do a grammar or spelling check, you could put your essay in and say, can you check the grammar or spelling on this? And it might be able to catch things that you've missed. Another use that I used a lot when I was preparing this presentation is to summarize something to decide whether it's worth my time to read it, or to check your understanding. So with this, I used mostly articles that are available free on the internet. So I didn't have to worry about, going through a paywall, or breaking the IP. Also, by using UM's GPT, we can put in articles that we have access to at U of M, without having to worry about that. So you could pop in the article and say, summarize this article for me. And it can give you a summary and go, okay, that's not the topic I'm interested in. Oh, it gets way off topic. That's not going to be helpful for me. Or, okay, this article seems like it's right on topic and it's going to be useful for me to read. And then you can go and read the full article yourself. And then checking your own thoroughness. So like, did you forget any important points? So if you pop your essay in here and say, are there any other main points that I would, need to discuss on this topic? Something like that. So you decided that you have a use case for using one of these GPT services. And so my number one tip is to be honest about using it, right? We always talk about academic integrity, about plagiarism, about citing your sources, right? The point of all those things is so that your readers can know where you got your ideas from. They can go back and look at your source material and decide whether they agree with you or disagree with you. They can decide whether or not they think your conclusions that you reached were valid, giving the information that you looked at to get those conclusions. So in order to do that, they need to know where you got your information. So whenever you're using any sort of resource, including a GPT service, you want to make sure that you're being honest about it. You want to make sure that you cite it. So right now, because all these things are always changing, I'm sure this will change. But for right now, what is considered best practice in academia is to include an in-text citation the same way you would to any other citation in your paper. To include a description in your reference section or your footnotes. So to include it with the other references that you're referencing. And then to include a transcript of your entire conversation in an appendix. So after the end of your paper, you'd write Appendix A, conversation with UM-GPT, and then you'd put, the text of what your conversation was. Just like I had those screenshots earlier where I showed my prompt and then I showed its answer, and then I showed my second prompt, and then I showed the answer. You'd want to put all that like that into an appendix so that your readers could go back to your original source material where you got your information and take a look at it themselves. Okay. Tip number 2 would be to make sure that you're writing a really good prompt. We're going to talk about prompt writing on the next couple of slides. But the key here is that you're going to need to adjust it and rewrite it as you go. Sometimes you might end up getting so off track, you just have to say like, delete this conversation and start a new conversation. But usually you can, sort of adjust it to tweak it to get just the information you're looking for. And we'll talk about that next. And then point number 3 is to check your output, right? We talk a lot about hallucinations. We talk a lot about misinformation. We talk a lot about bias. So just check the information that you're getting, and, note those things, at least to yourself, and remember them as you're working through. So do a fact or bias check and look for additional references for any information that it gives you. So if it gives you a fact, check somewhere else to make sure that you can confirm that fact, right? So in that first thing, it said something about, Leonardo da Vinci created this artwork, right? So that's easy to check. Just go to Wikipedia, look for that artwork, and see who the artist was, right? But you'll need to check any facts that it gives you, because just like in my example about Elon Musk, like it gave me that fact, and if I hadn't known that that wasn't true, I wouldn't have known, to check it. So it's good practice to check all the facts that it gives you. One way to check facts is by doing a SIFT analysis. So a SIFT analysis is a really quick way of evaluating the information that you're getting. And SIFT stands for stop, investigate, find, and trace. So basically, you just see a fact and you go, oh, there's a fact I need to check. Investigate it, figure out where you can go to check it, and then find a better or secondary source for the information. And then T is the one that's kind of hard with the GPTs because they don't really tell you what their training set was. But T is for trace the information to where it came from and make sure that it's a correct interpretation. That works a lot like with the articles that I read for this presentation. When a popular journal talks, has a headline about some crazy scientific discovery, you want to go to the original authors and make sure that the popular journal is actually saying what the scientists were saying, that they interpreted it correctly. So that's sort of what the T is there. And it doesn't work as well with a GPT, which makes it more important that you do part A or step 3 there, which is to look for an additional reference. So anytime it gives you a fact, just check and make sure that you can find somebody to confirm that fact or another place to confirm that fact. In order to get the information that you want out of a GPT, you're going to need to make sure that you're asking it the right question. So that comes from writing a really good prompt. The number one tip for writing a good prompt is to be very specific. Okay, so we're going to talk about how you can be very specific here. So, like with any other research, this is an iterative process. You can give it more tweaking as you go. You can give it feedback in real time. So once you ask a prompt, it'll give you an answer. If you don't like the answer that you got, or if you think it could do better, you can ask it to do better or to do it a different way. So you can say, make this shorter or use a more enthusiastic tone. And it will rewrite it and reprocess it to give it to you in a different form. And it might be closer to what you're looking for. If you find that you've gotten so in the weeds and the answers are just getting weirder and weirder, there's a button that says forget this conversation, and then you can start over again. But know going in that it is an iterative process and you'll probably need to make some tweaks, right? It's not going to be perfect the first time. Another tip is to try to avoid words that have multiple meanings or to define the word within your prompt. So if you write a prompt that says, write me a short history of Java, it might give you a short history of the island or the coffee or the programming language. So if you want it to give you a history of the programming language, say something more like, please give me a short history of the programming language Java. Or please give a short history of the island of Java, right? And that way it'll give you the right information that you're looking for, hopefully. There are some other variables to consider when you're writing your prompt, and we're going to go into detail on those variables on the next slide. One cool tip, though, that I ran across was that in order to reduce hallucinations, tell it that it's an expert in the field, right? So tell it that it should be taking the point of view of an expert, and then it will hopefully only search for information in its training materials that came from an expert author. And that should help to make its predictions more reliable and factual. So here are some examples of how you would change those variables. If you're looking for a different tone or voice, say you're a wary customer. Tell me why you're suspicious, right? You're telling it what type of tone you want. The point of view, you're an environmental engineer with an expertise in this particular area, right? So that would get you usually more factual information that would come. Tell it the academic level or your audience. So write for an audience of elderly people with not much computer experience, so that's the tell it to me like I'm a kindergartner, right? You can tell it the length. If you want a 3 to 5 sentence description, tell it you want a 3 to 5 sentence description. How enthusiastic it is. So you're an enthusiastic supporter of this. Why should I also support it? You're a wary customer. Tell me why you're suspicious, right? Any time, date, location information that you need. So set boundaries around the answer. So explain the countercultural revolution of the 1960s in the American Midwest and how it affected poor rural communities. So you're telling it the time, the date, the location, and any specific information to limit it. Tell it what points you want it to focus on. So write a poem about the University of Michigan. Could be anything, right? But write a poem about the University of Michigan that touches on its location, the diversity of its students, and the traditions. Is going to be, a more specific and narrower result. So here were some good examples where they combined several of these variables together to get the sort of prompt you probably want to start with. If you did one of these prompts and you didn't get something you like, you can always ask a follow-up question, like make this shorter, write this for an audience of elementary school students, something like that. For more information about prompt engineering, we do have a couple of websites already available on our website. So you can check those out for some more information on prompt engineering. And that is all I have for you today. Here's my contact information. If you'd like to get a hold of me, feel free. Send me an email. It's probably the easiest way. If you have questions about this or anything else related to the library, you can, like I said, always email me. We do have a chat service on the library's homepage where you can just click the button that says chat and you'll get one of us during business hours. Or you can stop into the Library Research Center and see whoever happens to be on call for the moment. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out. That's what we're here for, is to help you with your work while you're a student here.